Hey there, let's talk about Project 1. Project 1 is the first thing that you're going to peer review together, and it's the first thing that I'm going to give you feedback on so that you can revise for your portfolio. And even though this is just article summaries, yes, this is a project that you can include in your portfolio for sure. So really, there are three purposes for Project 1. The first is to get you guys collaborating with one another and to get feedback from me, and so that I can take a crack at looking at what your writing looks like right now and see where we need to go. It's a pretty basic kind of diagnostic project in that way. But it also serves two purposes that are related to what we're working on overall in this class, which is rhetorical analysis and then making the researched argument yourself. The first thing that it asks you to do is to select a topic. And so that's the first thing we're going to talk about. Deciding what's worth looking at, and then going about the research process in order to find good sources to then communicate to the reader exactly what you found. So that's the first thing you're going to do. Pick a topic and find good sources to talk about it that you can then present to the reader. The second thing that you're going to do, and this is a tough one for a lot of people, is work on writing objectively about other people's ideas. In this project, the only thing that really comes from you is the selection of the topic to look at. Everything else that you do is there to present what somebody else has said, and then to pay attention to the way that person went about presenting that idea for the context, for the audience that that person's writing to. So if you look at your assignment sheet, basically, your job is to look through the reader, mind, body, spirit, and then think about the theme. Think about what kinds of topics would fit in with the rest of the topics that are there. Most of the things that we're looking at have to do with analyzing kind of the human condition. What affects people's integration of mind and body and spirit as a citizen or as a whole human being? How does the idea of rationality, like in the Pentland article that we'll be looking at, affect the way people approach their physical lives, their spiritual lives? How does their spiritual life govern the way that they approach their physical day-to-day life and their bodies? This is a pretty broad topic that we've selected this year. I mean, overall, meta topic, really. But what you're going to be doing is looking for anything that seems to go along with that reader. Something that has to do with the way people organize and philosophize and make do with their lives in the world. Again, it's a big, wide open topic. I'm going to encourage you to play around with it. Find something that grabs your interest. Maybe something that you're interested in yourself. Maybe something that is about the intersection of spirituality and the more physical, mundane world that we live with. Maybe it has something to do with rights. Maybe it has something to do with what kinds of things we can legislate and what kinds of things we can't legislate. I'm going to encourage you to avoid looking at topics that you can find on your basic procon.org website, for example. And I do mention that website by name because I've seen it a lot in students' first works cited pages that come back before. If it's a commonly debated topic, there probably is already enough writing about that topic. If you do choose something, and here I'll throw out an example that I've seen a lot and that probably will not make a very good paper, abortion as a topic. You want to think about whether this is something that you can say anything new about, whether you can actually contribute to the conversation about it. Remember that Burkean parlor we talked about? There's a conversation that's been going on probably about anything you come up with. That's just a given. But when you walk into the conversation, you want to find a gap. You want to find something to say that maybe somebody else hasn't said, because you're going to come in with your own perspective. And you're going to look at all of the evidence that other people have brought to the table and brought into the conversation, and you're going to try to come up with a position that maybe others hadn't considered. Now, if you take one of the most common debate topics, that's going to be a lot harder to do. It's also going to be a lot harder to survey everything that everyone's already said in that conversation in the 8 to 10 pages that you'll use for Project 4. So I want you to pick an issue that you care about, something that maybe you haven't made up your mind about, and often that's going to make the best research projects. I will say that regularly the best research projects that I get, that I grade, are questions that a student hadn't really decided about, before they began looking at that topic. Then you get to go through the entire inquiry process. You get to research something that maybe you're curious about, or maybe that you hadn't really spent time with before. And then you get to look at the data, look at the research, come to a conclusion, and then try to convince the reader to come to the conclusion you came to just based on the research that convinced you. That's exciting. That's fun. That's creating new knowledge. If you try to start with a position, on the other hand, and then go looking for research that will confirm that position, you're going to find it's going to be much less effective in the long run. You're going to find it's a much harder way to do research, and it's a much, much harder way to make an argument because you aren't necessarily considering alternate points of view. We'll come back and talk about this again when we look at Projects 2 and Project 3, which are entirely research-based. Project 1, though, you're really kind of still just exploring different ideas. So my advice to you is choose a topic that you think you might want to write about when you get to Project 4. I apologize for the dings that you're hearing on my computer. When you get to Project 4, you might use this topic that you use in Project 1. You don't have to. You're not bound to this topic for the rest of the semester just because you wrote Project 1 about it. Okay, let's back up and look at the assignment sheet, which I promised you we would do. Choose a topic you want to look at. Maybe you want to look at something like the pure breeding of dogs and whether or not that's an ethical thing to do. Okay, so in that case, you've got an idea, you've got a question, you want to go and see what people have said about it. What you're going to do is look for 3 different articles from 3 different kinds of sources. The first is just a general web search. That's a Googling. So you Google for the result. Find something that's printed just on the web, published just on the web. So this could come from anything that ends in a .com or a .org or even a .net web address. No real requirements here. And now remember, you could start a website. I could start a website. You don't have to be an expert. You could be anybody, writing about anything. This is why web sources are sometimes not necessarily credible. That's not always true. In fact, there are a lot of web sources. There's a lot of web publication, web journalism that's just as credible as mainstream news sources, but it's a lot harder to verify it. And you've got to be careful as you go through the process of deciding, yes, this is how I know this is a credible source. For this project, you can choose anything. It's just a general web search. So that's your first article. Your second article, we'll come back to what you do with it in a minute. Your second article will come from an established mainstream news source. That means a major national news magazine, newspaper. This could come from the AP or the Atlantic Wire. This could come from even mainstream web-based magazines and journalism like, for example, Slate.com. If you want to search the New York Times archives, that is kind of our flagship national newspaper. CNN is also a mainstream cable news network, but they exist online. You have access to those articles as well. Think about something that isn't necessarily partisan. Think about something that will appeal to your educated mainstream individual. And you can define that in different ways, but we'll talk more once I see the sources that you come up with about whether this falls within the mainstream. If you can identify a direct political motivation automatically just from a basic reading of the article, it probably doesn't fall within the mainstream, or it's an editorial. Okay, so you want to strive for something that's supposed to be objective. Now, the difference between a web-based source and a mainstream news source is mainstream news sources are usually held to a higher standard by their audience. Audiences expect them to have a certain level of objectivity and of fact-checking. And if you print something in the New York Times that just isn't verifiable at all and that they haven't done research to establish, and they haven't fact-checked, someone's going to call them on it. And then the brand for the New York Times goes down, the value of it, and fewer people are going to read and trust that source. That's why generally it's seen as a more credible resource than just something that anyone could publish on the web. Also, usually the language is a little bit different because it's written by professional writers who've got to get to the point quickly. Okay? On the web, you don't know what kind of training or what kind of journalism has gone in, or what kind of scholarly or critical analysis. It's not to say that every web source is bad, just that the standards are different. because the audience is different and the review process is different. Now, speaking of review, your last source needs to come from something that comes from the Missouri State Library articles and databases page, most likely. If you can find something in print, great. But you can also use most of these resources online. You've got a link to the library's articles and databases page in our Blackboard site. You've also got a screen cap of what that page looks like in the assignment sheet for Project 1. So take a look at it. Now here's what you're looking for now. You're looking for an academic article. This is the kind of research that you're going to be using in most of your own research for your researched argument. And the papers that you're going to be dissecting there are going to have much more dense language. They're also going to be the papers that are subject to the highest degree of scrutiny. In order to be published in an academic journal, usually in the most credible ones, they need to go through something called peer review. Kind of like the peer review that we do in class, but a little bit different because the peers of the people who write these articles are experts in the field, and their job is to look at an article before it gets published in one of those journals and say, yes, this is credible, this adds value to the field. So if you can cite those sources, then you have something that has the highest degree of credibility as far as a source for one of your papers goes, which means ultimately that you will be more credible. That's kind of a basic rundown of the kinds of research you're going to do. When we get to Project 4, you can imagine we want the most credible sources we can possibly have, so the balance of sources needs to tip more toward mainstream news sources and academic journals and away from things that come straight from the web. For this project, though, and I know I'm bouncing all around this project, for this project, you want one of each of these that addresses the topic that you've chosen. They don't have to be exactly on the same topic, but they need to be related. So let's come back to that pure breeding of dogs example. You might find something that's a scientific experimental argument when you're looking for your academic peer-reviewed piece that talks about the effect of interbreeding within a species, or some kind of experiment that's been done related to that subject, and maybe the applications toward medical science. In the mainstream article, you might have something that's about a political protest related to this issue. And maybe from the web, you've just got somebody's opinion about something related to any kind of legislation that's going on, or just somebody's opinion about how you should treat your animals. They don't have to be exactly the same, but they need to be pretty closely related. And the reason that I say that is, one of the other goals of Project 1 is to get you to see how differently people write about the same thing when they're writing for a different audience and with different standards and expectations. Now, maybe you're going to find something on the web that's written to as high a standard as the mainstream news, or maybe even the academic journal, as far as the strategies that they use and the language that they use and the amount of documentation that they use. Maybe not, and that's something to note in your summary. All right, all of that's about the purpose of Project 1. Let's talk about what you literally have to put in your paper. The first thing, this is going to be about 2 paragraphs for each article. It's going to be very brief. The first thing you're going to do is write a summary of the article. And we've got another lecture that's about how to write good summaries as well as a handout. I'm going to have you refer to that. So write a summary. That's your first paragraph. Second paragraph, you want to tackle 2 things. One, and if you need to, you can split this into 2 paragraphs. So you might end up with 3 paragraphs for each article, but you could potentially do it in 2. After you give the summary, you want to talk about a little bit of the context, so the history, everything that goes along with that issue. And then you also want to give your rationale for including it in our second edition of the Reader. Basically, tell me why this is a good article to look at. What makes this particular language useful? What makes this particular kind of source useful? What makes the writing on your first article from the web different from your second article from the news, or your third article from peer review? Why should we look at it from each of these points of view? What does that contribute? Okay, so basically, you're going to pretend that I'm the editor of the book, and you're recommending these 3 things to me. And at the end, you want to give an MLA citation, and you can check Blackboard for more instructions about how to do that. I'm looking forward to reading your Project 1s. Please contact me with any questions that you might have, and hopefully I will see you very soon with your completed Project 1s.